Most women will never understand the power of their silence because most were never taught that their stillness is a mirror. A mirror so sharp, so precise, it cuts through the layers of a man's carefully built ego and forces him to face what he fears most, himself. Silence, when wielded by a woman who has known chaos and chosen stillness anyway, is not passive. It is an invocation. It is the breath before the storm, the ache in the void, the cathedral of self that echoes with everything he tried to suppress. And when that silence comes, not from pain, but from sovereignty, when it is calm, detached, feminine and whole, it becomes the most haunting melody a man will ever hear. She was once expressive, perhaps too expressive. She gave words to feelings that drowned her, emotions that flooded rooms, and softness that pleaded to be met. But life taught her, not through lectures, but through betrayal, abandonment, and the cold stares of men who looked at her but never saw her. So she stepped back, not to punish, not to manipulate, but to remember herself. In the Jungian sense, she began her individuation, the sacred withdrawal from projection, no longer casting her worth onto him, no longer demanding that he validate the flame she already carried. She stopped speaking because there was nothing left to explain. The energy that once moved outward turned inward. And in that transformation, she became something he could neither control nor consume. She became unknowable. And that's Nitz. What haunts him? For men who have not faced their own unconscious, the dark feminine is a terrifying presence. She carries the archetype of the shadow anima, alluring, dangerous, divine. She is the unclaimed part of his psyche, the mystery he aches for but cannot name. And when she goes silent, she triggers every wound he buried. Suddenly, without warning, the voices in his head grow louder. His validation supply is gone. His confidence begins to tremble. He wonders why she doesn't fight anymore, why she no longer reacts, why the battlefield is now quiet. But the silence is not empty. It is full of everything she withheld for too long. Her silence says, "I have seen who you are beneath the performance." Her stillness says, "I no longer need to beg to be chosen." And whether he admits it or not, the echo of her withdrawal replays in his mind like a requiem he can't unhear. Because deep down, he knows she didn't leave with a scream, she left with a whisper. A whisper that undid him. This is not the silence of ghosting or games. This is the silence that comes from awakening, the kind that cannot be faked, the kind that makes a man revisit every word he ever said to her, looking for the exact moment she stopped believing in him. It is the silence of the woman who no longer needs closure because she is her own closure. You see, men have been conditioned to respond, to challenge, to pursuit, to noise. But silence, it confuses them. It rewrites the entire game. When a woman no longer plays by the rules of insecurity, when she ceases to be available for crumbs, when she disappears not in body but in energy, it's not rejection, it's initiation. And only the man who is ready to meet his own darkness will survive. But most run. They look for the next woman to distract them, the next voice to drown out the silence she left behind. And yet, in the quiet moments when the noise dies down and he's alone with his thoughts, he remembers. Not her body, not her beauty, but her absence. The way it lingers, the way it questions him without speaking, the way it makes him confront the very thing he spent his life avoiding, his own reflection in the still water of her departure. You must understand this. The feminine is not always soft. Sometimes the feminine is terrifying in her depth. The woman who has stopped pleading and started observing becomes the high priestess of his undoing. She doesn't strike, she reveals. She doesn't shout, she witnesses. And in doing so, she forces a man to see whether his masculinity is built on presence or performance. He may try to forget her. He may mock her, diminish her, tell stories, to protect his pride. But the psyche remembers. The soul remembers. And somewhere, buried beneath the bravado, he knows he was once seen. Truly seen. And he didn't rise to meet it. There is no scream louder in the human soul than the silence of the woman who once gave everything. It is not the absence of her words that haunts him, it is the weight of all that was never spoken. Her silence is not a vacuum. It is a living presence. It lingers like incense, like sacred smoke after fire, curling through the cracks of his psyche, reminding him that something holy has left. And this is where the deeper layers unfold, where Carl Jung's shadow work emerges from theory into torment. 4. The woman has stepped into her shadow, not to become bitter, but to become whole. She has faced the chaos within herself. The jealousy, the rage, the hunger for approval. She held it to the light. She did not run from it. She danced with her darkness, and in doing so, made peace with it. This is the woman a man cannot manipulate, because she no longer manipulates herself. She is no longer impressed by dominance that masks insecurity. She is no longer seduced by affection that comes dressed as control. She has entered the underworld and returned with her own name written in flame. The man who once triggered her now teaches her. Not by intention, but by absence. She learns through the space he leaves, through the silence that demanded she grow. But for him, the journey looks very different. His shadow still lives unclaimed. And so, when he met her, this woman of depth, this embodiment of dark feminine magnetism, he could not help but project. She became the screen onto which he cast all his unresolved desire and fear. He saw her as divine, then dangerous, sacred, then suffocating. Because the feminine that sees too much threatens the illusion the masculine ego works so hard to maintain. And so, he fled. Or worse, he stayed and tried to dim her. But the woman who has met, her shadow cannot be dimmed. She can only be delayed. And when she finally chose silence, it wasn't punishment, it was prophecy. She saw the ending long before he did. She always knew. But instead of shouting, she waited, watched, withdrew. And now that she is gone, she is more present in his mind than she ever was in his life. Because now, she's not just a woman. She is an archetype. She is his anima unclaimed, the ghost of what he could not honor. And you are this woman. You must understand what you've become. You are not just hard to get. You are not cold. You are rare. You are a mirror. And to the man who has not done his work, your silence is unbearable. Because it forces him to sit with the consequences of his unconsciousness. It reveals the hunger behind his charm. It shows him that what he thought was control was only fear. In disguise, he may say he doesn't care. He may seem unmoved, attacks himself with detachment. Yet at night, when no one is watching, the feminine energy he dismissed begins to whisper again. Not in words, but in memories. In the way she used to look at him before she learned not to. In the way her voice once carried softness before it grew quiet. In the way she trusted too long before she chose herself. And he is left in a room full of distractions, none of which can silence the echo she left behind. What men do not understand is that feminine silence isn't passive, it's alchemical. It's the space in which she rebuilds herself, reclaims herself, and rises beyond the narrative he tried to place her in. And when she does return, if she ever does, she is not the same. She doesn't seek answers. She doesn't rehearse speeches. She looks at him, and he knows. He is no longer a character in her story. He is a footnote in her becoming. So he watches. From afar, maybe in regret, maybe in awe. But he knows something sacred slipped through his fingers, and she no longer bleeds for him. She writes poetry with the pain. She no longer waits by the phone. She whispers to the moon. She no longer fights to be heard. She listens to her own silence. Sand finds peace there. He will never forget the look in her eyes the last time they met. Not because she wept or raged, but because she didn't. There was no war left in her, no plea. Just a gaze stripped of performance, stripped of need. It was the kind of look that makes a man question everything because it does not seek to be loved. Only witnessed, and in that moment she became more than a woman. She became every woman he failed to understand, every emotion he turned away from, every sacred thing he dismissed in his chase for power, validation, or control. She became the very reflection of his own unconscious feminine. It terrified him. Carl Jung spoke of the anima, the inner feminine soul of a man. And when a man meets a woman who embodies the qualities of his repressed anima, intuition, emotion, creativity, karasi is either awakened or destroyed. If he's unprepared, he will project his shadow onto her, blaming her for the very feelings she stirred in him. He will call her too much, too emotional, too unstable, not because she is, but because he cannot bear the mirror. And so she disappears. Not always in body. Sometimes she's still there, lying next to him, sharing conversations, offering quiet kindness, but the soul has closed the door. The light that once poured toward him has redirected inward, and he feels it. Like winter setting in. Like a song that ends too soon. He might try to coax her back, with apologies, empty gestures, or memories. But none of it works, because he's not addressing the wound. He's addressing the absence. And she has learned presence is not earned through panic, is earned through depth in the beginning. She mistook intensity for intimacy. She mistook attention for love. She thought that if she just gave enough, held enough, waited long enough, he would finally see her. But instead, he consumed her. Not with cruelty, but with unconsciousness. And now, the woman he once took for granted has become an echo he cannot name but cannot silence. And you, if you are her, know this: your absence is not empty. It is instructive. It teaches him what your words never could. It shows him that you were not demanding, you were devoted. Not needy, were nurturing. Not dramatic, you were deep. Men often confuse feminine silence with indifference, but it is far more dangerous than that. True feminine silence is ancient. It is the silence of the moon watching the tides, the silence of a flame deciding whether to burn or not, the silence of a woman who has buried versions of herself and is no longer afraid of the funeral. There's a reason mystics, poets, and philosophers have feared the divine feminine for centuries. Because she doesn't follow, she doesn't beg, she doesn't fit into the mold designed to contain her. She rises, quietly, powerfully, without announcement, and when she goes, she doesn't look back, not out of arrogance, but because she has seen the truth. The man who could not meet her soul was never hers to begin with. Still, the ache lingers. In him, not her. She may feel the grief, the tenderness, the residue of love. But she no longer seeks completion outside herself. He, on the other hand, begins the slow unraveling, because for the first time he is left alone with the version of himself she once tried to love. And now he must ask, who am I without her gaze, without her belief, without her forgiveness? Most men never ask these questions. They run, they replace, they numb, but the few who dare to face them, those are the men who grow. Those are the men who enter their own shadow, their own anima, and begin the long, slow work of becoming whole. And sometimes only, sometimes they return. But by then, she has changed. She no longer waits for the return of what broke her. She does not need the apology, the explanation, the grand gesture. She does not seek closure because she became it. The silence that once protected her now empowers her. and she speaks only when she chooses. Not to be heard, but to create. So when he reaches out, finally humbled, finally aware, he finds not the girl he left, but the woman he was never ready for. The one who needed nothing, yet gave everything. The one who walked away, not out of pride, but out of sacred preservation. And perhaps, he realizes too late. Some women vanish without ever leaving the room. They sit across from you, still and golden in their silence. And yet they are already gone, drifting into a realm where your words cannot reach, your charm cannot touch, and your ego cannot breathe. You feel it before you understand it, this sacred withdrawal. A kind of spiritual departure that makes your lungs tighten and your voice falter. Because you know something divine has been lost. Something you never truly deserved, but always expected to stay. This is what happens when a woman no longer dances for the crumbs of a distracted man's attention. When she no longer flinches at his disapproval or waits breathless for his maybe to become yes, she awakens. Not through vengeance, but through clarity. The moment she realizes her value is not proven in proximity, but in peace, and now in this haunting quiet he begins to feel the presence of her absence. A presence that stalks the edges of his day. A presence that touches his memory with a whisper. She was real, and you failed to meet her. She gave him moments, unfiltered, trembling, raw moments of love that poured from her soul like prayer. He returned them with fragments, half-formed gestures, attention with expiration dates, affection laced with retreat. He thought she'd stay, because she always had. Until she didn't. Her silence is a ritual. A rebirth. A funeral of the woman she was when she still thought he could save her from herself. But now she sees he was never the savior. He was the mirror. A mirror that cracked the moment she finally looked at her own reflection and said, "Enough." And now he is left with his reflection. No noise, no distraction. Just the echo of her patience, her presence, her pain, and his refusal to witness any of it while he still had time. This is the truth that breaks a man open. The realization that her love was never weak. That it took more strength than he could comprehend to give so fully. That the woman he took for granted was in fact his greatest teacher. But the curriculum has ended. For a woman who has truly awakened does not go back. Not because she cannot, but because she has grown roots elsewhere. Roots in her own body, her own joy, her own calm. She no longer thrives on being understood. She thrives on understanding herself, and this new self no longer fits the container of their past. She doesn't tell him this. She doesn't need to. Her silence speaks more fluently than words ever could. It is not aggressive. It is not cold. It is simply full. So full of sovereignty that it leaves no room for negotiation. You may think silence is empty, but only when you've never known its weight. The man, if wise, will begin his descent not into madness, but into meaning. Into the wounds she reflected. The fears she activated. The ego she threatened. If he dares, he will begin the real work. The work of confronting the father wound, the mother complex, the masks of masculinity he inherited but never questioned. He will start to see that her withdrawal was not rejection. It was an invitation to rise. But rising means burning. Burning through every belief that told him a woman's love is endless, that she will always wait, that he can break her softness and she will rebuild it for him, that he can stay on the surface and still be worshipped by depth. No, not this woman. Not the dark feminine. For she is not the muse. She is the myth. She is not the lesson. She is the test. And if he fails to see her, really see her, she vanishes not as punishment, but as prophecy. The prophecy that says, only the man who knows how to hold the sacred can keep it. She is not cruel. She is not careless. She is simply done explaining her worth to the unready. And he, now alone with the silence, will begin to realize that the scariest thing in the world is not losing a woman's love. It is knowing you never rose high enough to meet it. There is no closure in the silence of the awakened woman-only consequence. A sacred stillness that does not seek to resolve, only to evolve. Because by the time a woman has gone quiet, she has already grieved. Not just the man, but the illusion, the future she imagined, the potential that never lived. She has buried a version of herself that begged to be chosen. And in its place now stands a woman who has chosen herself. You can sense it in her walk, in the way her eyes no longer linger, in the unbothered grace with which she carries her energy back to herself. This is not the silence of confusion, it is the silence of command. The kind of silence that echoes through a man's bones long after the sound of her voice has faded from his life. Men often romanticize the woman who leaves in anger, in fire, in rage. They understand the storm. They know how to fight back. But they do not know what to do with water that goes still, with a sea that no longer rises to meet them, with a tide that once pulled them in, and now withdraws without warning. This is the woman he cannot replace. She was never loud in her leaving. She didn't post cryptic messages. She didn't beg for attention. She simply stopped showing up in the way she once did, not as a punishment, but as an act of mercy for herself. Because staying in that dynamic would have meant abandoning the very soul she worked so hard to reclaim. You see, silence is the final form of feminine power. Not the silence of submission, but the silence of completion. The silence of a woman who no longer needs to explain why she deserves to be treated with reverence. A woman who knows that true love is not proven through suffering, but through alignment. And he may sense this, but he may not yet understand it. He may text, call, leave breadcrumbs, try to resurrect the dynamic with old habits. But her silence answers back, louder than any reply. Because she's no longer available for roles that ask her to shrink. She is no longer interested in dialogues that repeat the same emotional choreography. She has stepped out of the performance. This silence, it isn't empty. It's full of the life she's building without him. The joy of mornings where her nervous system is no longer bracing for the next disappointment. The freedom of no longer being tied to someone else's inability to hold space for her truth. And if he ever finds the courage to look past the ache, past the bruised ego, past the silence, he might finally see it. That what she offered was never a threat, it was a mirror. That the love she gave wasn't needy, it was a reflection of his own unmet longing. That her silence isn't cruelty. It's the echo of all the moments he had the chance to be present, and wasn't for the first time. He may realize he was not left, he was released. Released from the pedestal she placed him on. Released from the emotional labor she carried for them both. Released from the illusion that she would always be there, no matter how little he showed up. And this is your journey, must remember. You are not alone in this path. There are women across oceans and deserts, cities and forests, who have gone silent, not because they are broken, but because they are blooming. Women who realize that being quiet does not make you weak. It makes you sovereign. You are not bitter. You are not cold. You are simply awake, and in your stillness, you call in only those who can meet you in wholeness. You speak only when it is sacred. You give only from overflow. You do not chase, because you no longer seek rescue. You walk, not because you gave up, but because you finally looked in the mirror and saw God staring back. And what happens to the man who once held her heart? He will search for her in others, in faces that smile like hers, in voices that carry a note of that same softness. But he will not find her, because you don't just lose a woman like that. you lose access to her world, her frequency, her light, and you will never forget the sound of her silence. Asterisk. There comes a moment quiet and slow when a man finally understands that what he once had was not just affection, but alchemy. That the woman who once stood before him was not simply offering love, but an invitation into depth, into healing, into wholeness. And he turned away, not because he didn't feel the gravity of her presence, but because he was unprepared for it. Because depth demands vulnerability. And for a man ruled by ego, that kind of intimacy feels like death. So he chose comfort. Familiar patterns, the echo chamber of shallow affection where no mirror speaks back. He chose a world where he wouldn't have to look at his father wound, his shame, his fear of inadequacy. But in doing so, he lost the only woman who ever truly saw him beneath the armor, and now, in the silence she left behind, he finds no escape. It is there in the empty room where her laugh used to bounce off the walls. In the quiet after the party, when the crowd fades and all that's left is the memory of the way she looked at him like he was enough even when he wasn't. He hears her in his own stillness, in the quiet ache that no other woman seems able to touch, because she didn't just reach for his body, she reached for his soul. But she is gone now. Not because she stopped loving, but because she started honoring that love. She realized it could not survive in a space built on avoidance. She understood that begging for presence was a betrayal of her spirit. So she did the most radical thing a woman can do. She chose herself. That choice is the final revolution. It is the moment the feminine stops waiting to be chosen and becomes the one who chooses. Not with bitterness, not with spite, but with calm. With power. With grace forged in fire. She becomes the woman who walks away not because she lacks devotion, but because she has finally learned where that devotion must begin. Within, this is the birth of the sovereign feminine. A woman who knows her worth is not something to be negotiated. A woman who no longer tries to be palatable for men who can't hold her complexity. A woman who honors her rage without becoming consumed by it, who grieves fully and then lets it go. A woman who walks the path of individuation not to be admired, but to be free, and what becomes of the man. If he is brave, he will begin the work. He will stop blaming her for his discomfort. He will stop seeking versions of her he can dominate. He will turn inward, into his own shadows, into the haunted rooms of his childhood, into the lineage of men before him who silenced their emotions and called it strength. And if he stays long enough, if he feels deeply enough, he may begin to understand the feminine not as something to conquer, but as something to protect, to revere, to match. That is the path of true masculinity. Not control, but containment. Not dominance, but devotion. Not performance, but presence. Only then, only in that raw, honest reckoning will he begin to hear something in the silence. Not the echo of her absence, but the echo of his own return. And she will not be waiting. She will be somewhere else entirely, thriving in the fullness of her own life, creating, healing, dancing, resting, no longer looking back, no longer checking for the apology, no longer hoping he will rise, because she has already risen. And in doing so, she has become untouchable. She does not need to be remembered to feel whole. She does not need to be wanted to feel worthy. She does not need to be chased to feel chosen, because the woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.